new report, Meta now saying China has become one of the most aggressive actors attempting to sway U.S. public opinion through fake accounts, though it hasn't been very successful. Meta saying it recently took down 2 coordinated Chinese networks targeting foreign audiences, I should say. One included almost 5,000 fake accounts and primarily targeted Americans, often with posts about U.S. politics or U.S.-China relations. Join us right now to talk about all of this, the threatened landscape and other recent hacking news. Chris Krebs, the former director of the government's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, is now the president of Pinnacle One. Good morning to you.
Morning.
How big a threat is it? Which of the platforms do you think are most exposed right now, and what can be done about it, if anything?
Yeah, look, this has been going on with China driving information operations for a couple years ago now. So it was about a year and a half ago, a French intelligence think tank put out a report basically calling what China was doing the Russification of Chinese intelligence and information operations. So where Russia has been very dominant in pushing propaganda, fake news, disinfo for years and years, now China's getting into the game, kind of copying the Russian playbook. They're very active, but to the point, I think that Meta has made, they're not quite as successful. So they're not getting the traction they want. There's perhaps some cultural differences that they're not picking up on, but they're getting better with each subsequent iteration. What I'm seeing here is that Meta, across their various platforms, they're committed to rooting this stuff out. They have dedicated teams. Now, they've had a bit of a kind of a drawback in what their resources and headcount is, but they're still committed to it, and they're making these their findings publicly available through transparency reports.
Okay, so then the next piece is, what about TikTok?
Well, TikTok has similar resource investments. They have trust and safety teams. They are finding these sorts of campaigns, and they're taking them down. They're exposing them. The recent EU Digital Services Act is requiring companies to report what resources they have. TikTok has resources. Facebook has resources. Others don't have as much.
How do you think they're trying to manipulate, to the extent they can, this political moment? I mean, what is the misinformation that is being put out there? Which is the candidates that the Chinese are trying to stand up? Which are the candidates that they're trying to hit back at? What is the underlying theme?
Well, I think it's consistent with just about everything we've seen in the last couple of years. There's always like a grain of truth. And so they're amplifying good stories about China and what they're doing globally and what's happening in China. And they're amplifying similarly bad stories about the U.S. There was a campaign that was exposed about a year ago about rare earth companies, U.S. and Australian rare earth companies. And the gall of this story is that the Chinese were amplifying the environmental records of U.S. and Australian companies, and yet not giving any sort of help.
But we're not into a situation where somebody in China has decided, you know what, we want to stand up President Biden over former President Trump, or we're trying to stand up former President Trump over President Biden because we want to sow the seeds of more polarization, or because we believe that one candidate's going to be better for us later. I mean, is that?
I think it's too early to tell there, and that's probably what the intelligence community is really looking deeply into right now in advance of the 24 election. What are the motivations of President Xi, President Putin, and others, and how they would want an election to play out? And it's not just going to be who's president, but which way the Senate goes. The House is a little bit harder for some of these countries, I think, in their security services, because they're so diverse, and it really is based on individual House races. It's a lot tougher.
You said that Meta has cut back on staffing for this. I mean, I knew that Meta had cut headcount. I was thinking more of it was for the Meta stuff, but they've actually cut their staff.
They've cut staff across the board, and I think this is the post-COVID contraction when everyone kind of exploded their ranks, and now they're getting a little bit more streamlined.
But it's actually been in the places where they're policing.
There has been impact, but the folks that I know there that have been there for years are still there, and they're still committed, and they're still executing. I think the big challenge right now, and something that was pulled out of that report, is the recent transparency report, is the lack of sharing between government and the platforms right now, in part due to some of the court cases that are ongoing right now and that'll soon go in front of the Supreme Court. So to a certain extent, Facebook and Meta, Facebook, Instagram, they're on their own.
They're on their own.
You didn't mention X in any of that. Is there...
That's there's not a lot of transparency here. We don't really know what their policies are or how they're enforcing them. And I think that's what folks are looking to the EU and the Digital Services Act. Right. What are their commitments here? They have policies. We know they have policies, but how are they moderating? How are they enforcing against those policies?
I'm curious about this, talking about you're talking about what's happening in Europe. There's an argument being made that we, the United States and the FTC, are trying to help Europe. Do you know about this?
Generally familiar.
That we're trying to help Europe and that we shouldn't be. Meaning Ted Cruz and others have said that we're effectively hurting our own American companies because we're trying to help enforce or assist the Europeans in effectively enforcing their laws. What do you make of that?
It's not just limited to social media platforms. I mean, look, we don't have in the U.S. a federal privacy law. And yet the Europeans have had GDPR, right, General Data Protection Regulation, for years now. And so companies, tech companies in particular, are baselining against European laws because they don't want to have to bifurcate a governance structure between the U.S. and the EU. So a lot of those, the implementations are rolling over here domestically.
Chris, I want to thank you.
Thanks so much.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know how worried we should be. How worried?
In advance of the 24 election?
Yeah.
Look, so
compared to what people were talking about in 2020 and 2016.
The motivations of the actors across.
What's the worst that's going to happen? It's going to be Trump or Biden. Yeah, you should worry.
Well, no comment.
Does it matter who skews it one way or another?
I think the motivations of our adversaries are completely different than they were in 2020.
What would our adversaries want? They take your pick. They're both bad for us.
I think Russia and China in 2020 generally hung back. They said, "You guys do this yourselves."
Who would they want in 2024?